the holiday. You want to talk about Chanukah and the Kabbalistic and mystical significance of Chanukah. So the first thing we want to think about is, one way of figuring out what the meaning of any event is, if you can compare it to something else and contrast it, then you see the differences, and that is a way of determining meaning. So, for example, better or worse. So, for example, when it comes to the candles of Hanukkah, so we can compare it. I'm just trying to figure out the lighting here. I apologize. I don't know which one's better, but in any case, we can compare it to the candles of the temple, and the Hanukkah candles are really here to commemorate the miracle that happens in the temple. So, therefore, the changes and the distinctions between the Hanukkah candles and the candles of the temple are very telling. And that would be an insight, that would be sort of a window to allow us to define what the candles of Hanukkah represent, and therefore what the holiday represents. And if we have some time, also what the application is in our own service of Hashem. So we want to talk about a connection, in other words, contrast the candles of the temple to the candles of the menorah, of the Hanukkah menorah. We also want to talk about what the historical ramification of that is, and also the personal in the life of every Jew. So that's the roadmap for today. Hopefully, we can at least address some of it. So the first thing we want to discuss is in Judaism, as we know, unlike other systems of law, we preserve and study the machloka, the disagreement. So even though an opinion is not considered part of the law, nevertheless, we study it. And it's actually very interesting. One way to think about it is, it's a mitzvah to study Torah. So what happens if I only have 5 minutes a day to study? So I show up, I take out a Talmud, and I study the opinion that ultimately is going to be rejected. Ultimately was rejected. So in our context, we have a disagreement between Shammai and Hillel, the house of Shammai, the house of Hillel, and everybody knows that the halacha, the law, always follows Hillel. Okay, so I only have 2 minutes to learn. So I woke up in the morning, I open the Talmud, I study the opinion of Shammai. Then I'm called to go to work. Okay, did I study Torah? If Shammai has been disproved, the answer, you have studied Torah. Why? Because Shammai has not been disproved. In other words, even though when it comes to the practical halacha, the practical law of what we follow, we can only choose one, either Shammai or Hillel. They can both be right. But that's only in the world of practicality. But in the world of ideas, Shammai actually has a point, and Shammai has a valid point. And in some spiritual perspective, Shammai is right. And therefore, both opinions are right. So we want to apply this concept to Hanukkah and say we're going to derive some of the meaning of what Hanukkah is, not only from the house of Hillel, which the halacha follows, but also from the house of Shammai. What do I mean? So everybody knows that the disagreement between Shammai and Hillel regarding the lights of Hanukkah. Shammai says Hillel says that's the halacha. Every day you increase. You start with 1 candle and then you grow to 8. And that's the universal custom. However, Shammai disagrees. And Shammai says, every day you decrease. In other words, the first night you light all 8, and then the second night 7, etc., etc. And that was the disagreement. And what is the reasoning for this disagreement? So the Talmud explains. So Hillel is easy. Hillel tells you that Ma'ilin b'kodesh, you have to grow in holiness. So in holiness, the sign of growth in general, but specifically in holiness, the sign of growth is increasing. If today I do exactly what I did yesterday, I'm not increasing. So the point here is that Hillel says in holiness, in all matters of holiness, you have to grow. What's Shammai's reason? Why decrease? So there's all kinds of interpretations of what Shammai is saying. But here's what the Talmud says. The Talmud says every day, pochet v'holech, every day you decrease. Didn't Hillel say that in holiness is supposed to increase? So Shammai says, no, I have a precedent. What's the precedent? Parei hachag, the bulls of the holiday of Sukkot. What is that? What is he talking about? So in the holiday of Sukkot, every day they would bring a musaf, an additional offering in the temple. And the way they would bring the offering is the first day they would bring 14 bulls, if I'm not mistaken, I think 14, and then 13, etc., all the way down for the 7 days, and down. So in other words, every day they would decrease. So Shammai says, look, in the temple they decreased regarding the bulls of the holiday, bulls of the Sukkot. So the same is true for the Chanukah. Okay, fine, that's Shammai's reason. But what do we take away from this? In other words, if we're trying to uncover, if we're trying to get to the DNA of the holiday, one of the things we learn from Shammai is that there is a unique connection between the holiday of Chanukah and the holiday of Sukkot. So again, if you want to try to figure out what's the concept what's the spiritual makeup of Chanukah in addition to the historical event, but what is the energy of Chanukah, and what level of holiness is available in Chanukah? You want to relate that to Sukkot. Also, another connection with Sukkot is that both are 8 days, right? All holidays are no other holiday is 8 days. Rosh Hashanah is 1 day from the biblical perspective. Yom Kippur is 1 day. Shavuot is 1 day. Passover is 7. The only holiday that's 8 is Sukkot. So if Hanukkah has 8 days and Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot has 8 days, that's not a mistake, but there is a connection. So that's another clue. What we're trying to do here is assemble clues. Okay, one interesting difference between the holidays, as we began by explaining that we want to compare the candles of the menorah to the candles of Hanukkah to the candles of the temple, and that will give us some insight into the nature of the holiday. So one thing to think about is that when the timing, so besides the fact that the candles, so we know the candles of the temple had 7 branches or 7 lamps, 6 branches and 1 stem. You had 7 candles, but Hanukkah is 8. So that's an important difference. It's not just a technicality that, well, it were 8 days, so we light 8 candles, because it could have well been there are 8 days, so we light the candle for 8 days. It doesn't have to be that there are 8 candles. So the simple interpretation is that we don't want to replicate, we don't want to get too close to the service of the temple, because we want to understand that the service of the temple was unique, and we're not able to perform that service outside the temple. So we specifically differ from the number of candles that are in the temple, lest somebody think that we think that we're lighting the menorah of the temple. So that's the technical reason. But there's also a biblical reason, a spiritual reason, and that will be expressed in the difference between the numbers 7 and 8. And the temple represents 7, and Hanukkah represents 8. So that's one point. An additional point is the timing. When would they light the menorah in the temple? The answer is in the afternoon. They would light it in the afternoon, approximately Plaga Mincha, which is approximately an hour and a quarter before sunset. So they would light it during the day. Hanukkah candles, you specifically are supposed to light after sunset. And again, that's a departure. And remember, we would assume that if the candles of the menorah are here to commemorate the candles of the temple, then they should be in some ways similar in some ways. As the sages say, that whenever the sages institute something, a custom or a commandment, they try to make it as similar as possible to the biblical commandments, because they want some source for this custom. And yet, when it comes to the Hanukkah candles, the timing of the Hanukkah candles, there is a significant departure that the temple candles were lit in the afternoon, when it was still a significant amount of time for daylight. However, the Hanukkah candles were supposed to light specifically after sunset. So these are the questions, and hopefully they will lead us to get to the essence of Hanukkah. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to explain it from the spiritual energy, And then we're going to try to get it connect it to the historic events of Hanukkah. And then we're going to try to connect it to our own service of God. So in short, the energy is as follows. In other words, what happens at Hanukkah? What's at stake? So there's all kinds of ways of looking at Hanukkah. You could look at Hanukkah is that our political autonomy was at stake, our political freedom. You could say our power to our freedom to worship God was at stake. But if you look at the prayer and the prayers that describe Hanukkah, and also the piece of Talmud that describes why we celebrate Hanukkah, it talks about the Greeks entering the temple and defiling the oil. Okay, so what you see here, there's a spiritual battle taking place between Greece, the Hellenists, Greece, and Israel. In other words, if you want to destroy someone's political aspirations, you're not going to go into their temple and defile their oil. That represents, in other words, what does it bother the Greeks that we have pure oil? I mean, what's the difference? What's at stake here? So you see that they were not so much battling. In other words, at the core of their battle was a philosophical idea against Judaism. And as we're going to explain, as the Hasidic discourses explain, it wasn't specifically Judaism. In other words, what really irked them about Judaism is not the rational parts of Judaism, but the irrational points of Judaism. And Judaism, I hate to break the news to you, does have irrational points or super-rational points that are beyond, that defy understanding. And what is the prime example? We know, we're going to discuss it later, we know there's different categories in the Torah. There are mitzvot that have a reason. There are mitzvot that commemorate. There's generally three categories of commandments. There's a commandments that have reason. There are commandments that commemorate historical events, like Passover, for example. And then there's the commandments that are chok, it's a decree, there are no reason. And what's the quintessential example of a mitzvah that has no reason? The laws of purity, ritual purity, and impurity. They're not logical. It's completely mystical, completely super-rational. So if you're a Greek and you serve human intelligence, most offensive about Judaism to you is the parts of Judaism that are super-rational, or in your words, not your words, in the words of the Greek, irrational. So when they come to the temple, what's irking them? What's the first thing they do? They run and say, where could we find the pure oil? Because we have to make it impure, right? So that just shows what's at stake here from their perspective. So that's the spiritual battle. So we know that what caused, in other words, what's happening here is that the spiritual battle between the Greeks and the Jewish people is basically a battle about, in other words, the battle is a spiritual battle. And the Greeks understand that they have to defile the oil. And again, the reason why they're defiling the oil, as we explained, is that the oil represent the idea of purity and impurity is super rational. The Greeks can't handle it. Now, if you want to get more specific, according to Kabbalah, shemen, oil, represents chachma, wisdom, right? That's why even in many cultures, the concept of wisdom is enlightenment. And enlightenment, light, comes from oil. So oil represents wisdom. Now, Judaism has plenty of wisdom within Judaism, but it's pure oil. What do I mean when I say it's pure oil? It's not wisdom per se, it's sacred wisdom. In other words, it's wisdom that understands that there are certain things that are greater than wisdom. It's a wisdom that understands the limitations of wisdom and how wisdom itself leads you to recognize that wisdom cannot grasp everything, and that there are things that transcend wisdom. So that's holy oil, right? Holy oil is almost a contradiction. Holy represents super rational, it's above understanding, but oil represents enlightenment, wisdom, understanding. So how do you have both together? Because Torah, wisdom, Jewish wisdom is rational, you understand, but and you seek to understand and you want to understand. All of a Jewish learning is a quest for understanding. However, part of understanding, like I said, is holy oil. You understand that there's a concept of holiness, of sacredness, of purity and impurity, which is super rational, which cannot be understood completely. But you understand the limitations of the mind. You understand that just because the mind can't grasp something, it doesn't mean it's not true. To the contrary, if the mind can grasp it, it may not be true. In other words, that I mean to say that if you look at modern physics, the mind it defies logic, but it's reality. So the mind has to be able to understand the limitations of the mind. So that's the holy oil. The Greeks, however, the Greeks were understood. In other words, they valued rationality. They valued logic, and that's why it's fascinating. If I'm a Greek and I want to put the temple service to a stop, what would I do? I would destroy the oil, but not the Greeks. They don't destroy the oil. What do? They defile the oil. They make it impure. So what does that represent? It means they don't have any problem with oil per se. They don't have a problem with enlightenment. They like enlightenment. They like Jewish knowledge. They think the Jews are very creative and they have great minds and they come up with good ideas. It's wonderful. But what offends them is not the oil, but the pure oil. And that's the battle between the worldview of the Greek and the worldview of the Jew. The Greek serves rationality, serves the mind. The Jew has oil, but the oil is sacred oil, which means I have oil, I have wisdom, I understand, I use my mind to navigate reality, to navigate my life, but I recognize that there's holiness within the oil. I recognize there are things that defy logic, and logic can't solve all your problems, and logic cannot get you to the ultimate truth. In fact, the true logic is understanding the limitations of logic. And therefore, that's when they come into the temple. The big miracle here is expressed with the concept of finding oil. And that's the part of the miracle we commemorate, which is a little bit of a problem. From a historic perspective, Chanukah is really, how do I say this? Chanukah is really two miracles, two events coming together. And they're related, but they're different. And we seem, at least the rabbis, seem to make a big deal about the detail that's insignificant. What do I mean? So the Chanukah commemorates the military victory over the Greeks, which was a big deal because the Greek army at the time is the most powerful army in the world. And the Jewish people, a few guerrilla fighters, are able to rid the land of Israel of the most mighty army in the world. I mean, it happens again. We know this all the time. We see it all the time, that the power of guerrilla warfare. But the bottom line is that's considered a miracle. That's a big event. That has real ramifications. That has long-term ramifications. The Jewish people are able to recreate a Jewish kingdom and Jewish autonomy for 200 years after the story of Hanukkah. That's a big event. I would expect that to be the highlight of the miracle, of the celebration, of the commemoration of Hanukkah. In reality, what are we commemorating? A small miracle. Small, I mean, there's not that, the ramifications are not great. They didn't have enough pure oil to light they only had enough pure oil to light for one day. And God made a miracle that lasted for 8 days. Big deal. In other words, what happens if God wouldn't make, let me ask you a question. What happens if God would not make the miracle? So it's not that the oil, they wouldn't light the menorah. People think they wouldn't light the menorah. It's not a tragedy. They didn't light the menorah for a few days. What's the problem? It's much more than that. If God would not make a miracle, you know what they would do? The law is they're allowed to light impure oil, because the law is that if the entire congregation is impure, the impurity is postponed, is pushed away. Right? We know the precedent from the holiday of Passover. If a few individuals are impure, then those few individuals, instead of offering the first Passover, they offer the second Passover. But the law is that if the entire congregation is impure, then the impurity is pushed away because of the power of the community. So there's not a lot at stake at the Hanukkah miracle, the oil miracle. It's not a lot at stake. What would happen if they would not find the jug of the oil of the high priest? What would happen if God would not make a miracle and that jug would not last for 8 days? Big deal. So they would light oil with impure oil. They would light the menorah with impure oil. It's not wonderful, but it's not a tragedy. So we have two events. We have one event that we rid the land, that we overcome the most mighty army in the world, and we regain our political freedom, and therefore religious freedom, and we reestablish a Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel for 200 years. That seems like a big deal. And yet, what do the sages say? How do we commemorate this? Remember, whenever we commemorate a victory, a physical victory, the emphasis is on meals. You're supposed to have a meal. On Hanukkah, it doesn't say anywhere it doesn't say in the Talmud you have to have a meal. I mean, you can have latkes and you can have donuts, but it's not a meal. That's not the mitzvah of the day to eat a meal, at least according to most opinions. But the commemoration of the holiday is the lighting of the candles, which highlights a seemingly very small and insignificant miracle. Certainly a miracle that pales in comparison to the miracle of the victory of the military victory. So what's happening here? So the Hasidic interpretation is as follows. Make no mistake, the oil, the miracle of the oil is in some ways deeper than the miracle of the victory over the Greeks. Why? Because the victory over the Greeks is a technical battle. But if you want to get to the root source, what was at the heart of the conflict between the Jew and the Greek? In other words, what was at the conflict? Why did the Greeks outlaw Judaism? Because of the concept of the pure oil. So the pure oil actually represents the essence of the dispute between the Jewish culture and Greek culture. And therefore, the fact that we are able to light the menorah with pure oil, not oil, oil represents grease, represents logic. And logic, in other words, logic as the highest way, as the highest thing in the hierarchy of the human and what a person should serve. So the Greek serves the oil. The Greek serves logic and rejects the concept of purity and impurity. And if we were to light the menorah with such oil, that would symbolically it would be, what's the point of winning the Greeks if we're now adopting their worldview? So God makes the miracle to allow us to light with pure oil, not just because it's a technical miracle. Now, finally, we're able to do the ritual correctly. No, because pure oil represents the reason why we went to battle in the first place. Why did we go to battle in the first place? We go to battle in the first place because we are battling the spiritual perspective of the Greek. And the spiritual perspective of the Greek is that you serve logic. The Jew says no. Logic recognizes the holiness that transcends logic. And that is what's at stake. And that's expressed in the miracle of the oil. Now we start connecting the dots here. Now we start connecting the dots. When you think about what is the essence of oil, pure oil, so pure oil represents the recognition that logic, that we're dealing here with something that transcends logic. In other words, even within godliness, there's godliness that could be understood. That's the level of godliness which creates the world. Why do I say it could be understood? Even though I don't understand godliness, I can't define it. I can't take it to the lab, just like I can't define what a soul is or what life is. But I could understand it because by seeing its effect, right? If you think about the human soul, if you think about the human soul, do I know that I have a soul? Can I prove I have a soul? So the answer is, or life in general, what is life? The answer is it's undefined. And from one perspective, you say, I can't define what it is. But on the other hand, it is logical in the sense that I could see its function. And by seeing its function, I have a certain understanding of what it is. That is true about my own soul giving life to my body. So I don't know what the essence of a soul is or what the essence of life is, but I do know I could see the function of a soul. I see it has the power to give life to a body. And the same thing is with godliness, which we call the soul of the world. So the level of godliness that creates the world, even though we can't define its essence, but we have a certain understanding and estimation what it does. Oh, I see its effect. It's able to create this vast universe. Okay, but what about the light of God that transcends creation, right? So there's a light of God, the infinite light of God is too great even to be described as the creator, because the essence of God is far greater than being a creator. Creator is something he does. Imagine you build a Lego set, and I say, who are you? Well, you are the person who created the Lego set. That's offensive because creation of the Lego set is only something you did. That cannot define who you are. So we have within godliness as well, there's a level of godliness which can be understood. And then there's the level of godliness which transcends understanding, the infinite light of God. Okay. So the Kabbalah says as follows. On Hanukkah, when the Jewish people, in other words, the period of Hanukkah, when the Jewish people battled the Greeks, and they had to understand that what's at stake here, we're connecting to the oil, the pure oil. In other words, we are thinking about on Judaism as a way where we connect to God, not just logically, but we connect super rationally. In other words, we connect to the parts of God that defy understanding. So now we're touching the infinite light of God. In the language of the Kabbalah, the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of God. Okay. The infinite, once you tap into the infinite light of God, you have an advantage. What's the advantage? The advantage is you are able to illuminate darkness. In other words, you have conventional light. Conventional light can create light in its own area, but conventional light cannot transform darkness. The light that transcends creation, in other words, the infinite light of God, can actually transform the darkness. So what's happening here is like this. Why do we light the menorah for 8 days? Why do we light the menorah at night? Because that tells us, that's the indicator, that's the sign that when we light the menorah and we commemorate the energy of the miracle of Chanukah, what we're really tapping into not conventional light of God, not natural light of God, but we're touching the infinite light of God. And the infinite light of God has the power to illuminate, to transform the darkness. So in some ways, the light of Hanukkah is much greater than the light of the temple. Why? The light of the temple is beautiful light. It's very inspiring and it's heartwarming. It's wonderful. However, the menorah of the temple was produced light in a time of spiritual daytime. In other words, it produced light in a time of spiritual enlightenment. Okay. But if you're going to lose that spiritual enlightenment in a time of darkness, in a time of difficulty, in a time of exile, that light that was in the temple is not going to help you. And that's why the light of the temple has 7 candles. 7 candles, as a rule, means nature. So we're talking about, it's beautiful, it's a revelation of God, but it's the revelation of God as God manifests himself within nature. In other words, those aspects of God which we can perceive and internalize. And that is wonderful when we are in a spiritual enlightened moment. And that's why we light the menorah of the temple, not at night. We light the menorah during the day when the sun is still shining, because the light of the menorah represents spiritual holiness. But what level of spiritual holiness? The level of spiritual holiness which is available when the spiritual enlightenment, which is the holiness that we can perceive and we can internalize and we can tap into. That's 7, and that's daytime. Okay. What happens when we are spiritually challenged? There's no more spiritual enlightenment. Why that is? Because of the Greeks, because now there's spiritual darkness. Okay. So now you say we're in a worse spot. We don't have the light. It's not light of day. We're in darkness. Okay. But if you're able to bring light into the darkness, that means you're tapping into the infinite light of God, because the infinite light of God could express itself everywhere. And therefore, the candles of the Chanukah menorah are not 7, which represents nature. Or in other words, that represents the godliness as God manifests himself in nature, but it represents number 8. And number 8 represents the super rational, a higher than nature, infinite light of God. Because in the Kabbalah, 7 is the cycle of nature. That's why you have 7 days of the week. And 8 is what transcends nature. So now we say, why are we lighting the candles of the menorah? Why are we lighting the candles of a menorah? First of all, why are we lighting them for 8 days? And second of all, 8 nights. Not 8 nights. Why do we have 8 candles? And why do we light them at night? If during the temple we lit them at day, that's exactly the point. What the Chanukah oil represents, the holy oil that we found, the jug with the seal, with the seal of the high priest, that represents the fact that we can tap into holiness and get the infinite light of God and be able to illuminate the darkness. And if we're illuminating the darkness, it's only because we tap into a level deeper than nature, deeper than God manifesting through nature, but we tap the number 8. So again, on the surface, it looks like you have a little bit of light in the darkness. During Hanukkah, it's at night, it's not so dark, a few candles. It looks like we're not in that same spiritual state as light, a spiritual enlightenment of the temple. In some sense, it's true, but on a deeper level, the opposite is true. Because to have light during the times of the temple when spiritual enlightenment is available, it's wonderful. But what level of light are you tapping into? Natural light. In other words, even within God, the lower level of godliness, which creates nature. But if you manage to be able to light up the darkness, that only comes if you can tap into a much deeper level of godliness, of the essential light, of the light of God that transcends nature. So that's in the language of the Kabbalah. And I wanted to say a point or two to make it a little bit more practical. So first of all, I want to say that the miracle happens. They find a jug of oil that's sealed with the seal of the high priest. That's what the Talmud says. They found, that's how they knew it wasn't defiled. Basically, for a person who's impure, to defile oil, you actually have to touch the oil. So what the Greeks do, they come into the temple, they go to find the oil, they break all the seals, they touch the oil, and now the oil is spiritually defiled. Again, it's not, like I said, what that represents is they want wisdom, but they don't want the sacred wisdom. They don't want the wisdom that realizes that there's something that transcends wisdom. Okay, so they find one jug that's sealed. So you could say, why did they find that one jug that was sealed? Well, because it's by accident. They forgot one jug, so we found the extra jug. But from the Kabbalistic perspective, there's a place within your soul that the Greeks cannot challenge. And the miracle of Chanukah happens when you touch that place within your soul. In other words, there are some certain levels of your soul where the Greeks can challenge, and there's a battle, and they can even defile. But the miracle of Chanukah represents that there is a little jug within yourself that's stamped and sealed with the seal of the high priest. And because that's sealed with the seal of the high priest, we'll discuss what that means in a moment, that part of you is, it's not that technically the Greeks didn't get to it. That part of you is insusceptible to the defilement. That part of you is not susceptible to impurity. And that, when the Jews tap into that part of themselves, then they're spiritually pure, and then they can battle the Greeks. So what do I mean? So again, if you have a commitment to Judaism, or if I have a commitment to Judaism, same is true, by the way, a commitment to another person. So if it's predicated on logic, then over time, that relationship could weaken. Because why? Because I say, well, it's love, it's not, I think about it and I say, it's actually very desirable to love God. Okay, tomorrow somebody could convince me it's actually more desirable to do something pleasurable in a way that is destructive to your relationship with God. So when you're talking about the rational mind, even when it's enlightened, is susceptible to impurity. It's susceptible to challenge. It's susceptible to failure. So what does it mean that the miracle of Chanukah comes about when they find a jug of oil that is sealed with the seal of the high priest? In other words, they find a jug of oil that's not susceptible to impurity within this human soul. What that means is a part of you, your essence, the essence of your soul, the bond between your essence of your soul and God is not predicated on logic. It's not because you understand. It's not because you meditated. It's because it's an essential bond. That's who you are. Similar to a relationship between a parent and a child. It could be covered. It could be, there could be difficulty and challenges. But when you go to the core, they're always connected. And the same thing is with the Jew and God. And if you can tap into that place, that the bond between me and God is not because I understand that this is valuable. If it's predicated on logic, it's predicated to it, then it's susceptible to impurity because I can always understand something different. But if it's predicated on that essential bond with God, then it's not susceptible to impurity. That part of me is always connected and always loyal to, that part of me is always connected and always loyal to God. And that is how we win. We fight the Greeks, and that is how we win. What does it mean? Because the Greeks are telling you, they're trying to convince you that what is supernal, what reigns supreme is logic. But you touched a part of your soul that where the relationship with God is super rational and it's deeper than logic. And because it's deeper than logic, it's more powerful, and therefore it actually can come and illuminate the darkness as well. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. There's a lot more to say, but it's Friday. I think it's the shortest Friday of the year. So there's a lot to do today. And the bottom line is, when we talk about the history of Chanukah, it's not just for commemorating the past, but commemorating the battle that's ongoing between the philosophy that says that logic is supernal, logic is supreme, you only serve what you understand, and the Jewish view, which says logic is important. You need oil, you need enlightenment. The whole purpose of the menorah is enlightenment. However, you cannot forget that the enlightenment has to be pure, meaning to say that the mind itself would direct you to something that's greater than the mind. What is greater than the mind? Greater than the mind is the infinite light of God. And when we tap into the infinite light of God, then we are able to illuminate the darkness. And that's our job over the exile. Let it be speedily in our days. We'll finish transforming the darkness to light and with the coming of Mashiach. Thank you all for listening and have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos, and happy Chanukah, of course.